dear rectors, dear professors, esteemed faculty members, distinguished guests, and dear students. It is my absolute joy and an absolute privilege to be able to address you today at the new academic year opening of the International Faculty of Engineering. And I have no doubt that in this very room, we have some of the brightest minds in this country today. And I have no doubt that each of you has persevered through endless exams, sleepless nights, labs, different student competitions, and in the end, as very stringent and strict selection program in order to find yourself in this room. Congratulations. And I have no doubt that you have a great and enormous potential, every single one of you in this room. And I would like to say that with your potential comes responsibility. And I dare to say, as the opening thesis, that we are currently experiencing perhaps the most serious geopolitical tensions in the world since the end of the Cold War. And I will share with you a few reflections that hopefully will encourage you to have, first, the rationality to accurately assess the circumstances in which we all find ourselves in. Second, the humility to identify our own place, your own place, in this grand scheme of things, however modest. And third, the audacity to develop a bold vision of how each of you, with your unique talents, intellect, and potential, can seek to play a positive role and serve in this trying time. And to begin, allow me to recall the words of the American writer David Brooks, who once wrote that there are two sets of virtues: the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the ones that make us successful in our professions, whether we're skilled at teaching, adept in science, or accomplished in the marketplace. These are the qualities that fill a CV of every one of us, that secure positions, promotions, and titles. But then there are the eulogy virtues, so the qualities of our character that others remember during our funeral. Were we kind? Were we courageous? Were we generous? Were we honest? Were we capable of deep friendship? And were we capable of deep love? And we all somehow, I suspect, instinctively know and feel, though we sometimes forget, that the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume ones. For achievement alone does not provide moral fulfillment. A career may bring us importance, but not necessarily significance. Many who have amassed status and wealth and prestige will in the end of their lives admit, in the quiet of reflection, I have achieved success, but not depth. I have gained importance, but not significance. And yet, significance is what I suspect we truly long for: a life of character. Therefore, let's ask ourselves, how does character actually develop in reference to the eulogy virtues? And we're really good at talking about material things and skills for the marketplace, but we're really bad at talking about character and values in today's world in a way that doesn't sound old-fashioned and archaic and out of place or amusing. We have lost the language to do so. Our professional language has become overly commercialized and overly politicized and morally underdeveloped. Most of us have clearer strategies for how to achieve career success than we do for how to develop a profound character. So this is the challenge before all of us. And I believe that answer to that challenge, and indeed, perhaps to the question of the meaning of life itself, lies in attempts to take responsibility. Responsibility for others, responsibility for truth, responsibility for the common good. And as I've mentioned to start, today's world calls for responsibility. And so to you all in this room, I encourage you to ask yourself, at what point do your particular unique talents, skills, and intellect meet the world's greatest need? And myself, for the first time, I found myself desperately trying to answer that question about 10 years ago. It was December 2015. And I was during a winter break at my own university, volunteering on an island of Lesbos in Greece. It was the height of the refugee and migrant crisis, with thousands of people trying to seek asylum in Europe and cross the Aegean Sea, part of the Mediterranean Sea, swimming from Turkey to Greece. And under the EU Facilitation Directive, EU law, humanitarian aid at sea began to be criminalized. So any act of rescuing people in the water was equated with assistance to human smuggling. So under threat of arrest, we were forbidden to bring people safely to shore. And a dark, cynical joke emerged amongst the volunteers. How can you tell that someone works for UNHCR? Well, they never get their shoes wet. And the first night on the shore, myself, serving with a group of other volunteers, helped about 3 boats, approximately 30, 40 people on each boat. But 17 people drowned by the Turkish shore. And I told myself that I must, as much as I can, try to empirically understand what pushes a mother to put a child, her own child, on a boat on which, if I had one, I would never put one myself. And I wanted to understand it as much as I could, deeply, and profoundly, and viscerally, so that perhaps one day, much later, I could try to prevent these tragedies. And then for the next 8 years, with near obsession, to be frank, and taking risks, I've tried to carry that responsibility. After working in refugee camps in Greece, I then moved to working in refugee camps in France, then in Turkey and Jordan on the Syria crisis, then on the ground in Iraq following the Battle of Mosul and the collapse of the self-proclaimed ISIS Caliphate. And then I completed a nearly 2 years deployment to Yemen, running a water sanitation mission and a medical mission responding to cholera crisis and then COVID-19 pandemic. And time and again, I said farewell to my protesting family here in Łódź in order to throw myself where state had collapsed and the systems, institutions were failing, to try to, as much as I could, to learn, to try to serve, and above all, to try to understand. Until my last mission, which was the 12-month deployment to Ukraine, where I served as a head of mission for Intersos, an international humanitarian organization providing medical, psychosocial, and material frontline assistance during the first year of the full-scale war, where I served between April 2022 to April 2024. And it was one of the greatest honors, perhaps, of my life. And then one day, on the 14th of January 2023, during a mass missile attack, a hypersonic missile, a so-called Kinjal, struck into a residential building next to our office, a walking distance from our base in Dnipro. And Kinjals, the missiles, hypersonic missiles, fly with a speed of 4,000 kilometers per hour, and no Ukrainian missile defense system can intercept them effectively. So 236 apartments had collapsed. It was very widely covered by the media. It looked as if some monstrosity devoured an enormous part of a residential building. And a lot of bodies were simply caught under the rubble with no means to retrieve them, but which were just pronounced as missing. And despite having tried, your age really, having tried to seek bigger and bigger tools of impact and building bigger and bigger teams and seeking bigger budgets, and despite the fact that at that stage already I was running a 250 staff international mission in Ukraine, all that I could do at the time was to go to the impact site, and I took a candle with me, which I used in my Kyiv office when we were losing electricity. Every couple of hours there was electricity loss. And I remember, sort of foolishly lighting that candle underneath the impact site and just sitting by the ruins. You know, humanitarian work alone, no matter how devoted, is like putting a band-aid on a wound that keeps getting shot and shot again and again. And for every life we saved, whether in Yemen or in Ukraine or Iraq or in refugee camps, there were many, many, many more that we could not. And all assistance was never enough. And it always seemed so grossly insufficient. And without concrete economic sanctions, and without legal prosecution and enforcement of international rule-based order, all humanitarian actors in conflict they're actually capable of is, like Linda Polman once cynically and brutally wrote, they're handing out sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. And the United Nations and other humanitarian agencies are, in some ways, indeed, the conscience of the world. They carry the duty of bringing aid to those in need. But too often, they become a substitute for real action, a way for governments to outsource their primary responsibility. And too often, they shift the focus away from those who truly have the power and truly have the duty to act, the political actors. And the same applies to the unspeakable violence and suffering found today in Gaza. Humanitarian aid is therefore necessary to save lives, but the real solutions are not to be found on the ground in Dnipro or in Bakhmut or in Gaza, but to be urgently fought for outside, here, in Warsaw, in Brussels, in London, in Beijing, and in Washington. That reflection and that sense of helplessness at that time on the 14th of January, in the face of these enormous human rights violations, were ultimately for me the reason why I decided to return to Poland a few months later and to put myself forward to run for office. And to try my best to seek bigger tools of impact so that Poland also does not slip into autocracy. And I believed, with my own assessment, that at that time, a couple of years back, we were dangerously going into this authoritarian populist direction, but that we take place as a rightful, serious, and responsible leader of NATO's eastern flank. And dear students, today is the 1,316th day of Russian war in Ukraine since the Russian full-scale invasion. 1,316 days of our neighbors waking up to pools of blood of their beloved ones from yet another Shahed strike, drone attack, missile attack from ballistic missile, hypersonic missiles, hitting yet another apartment block, school, kindergarten, a university like this. And brave and battered Ukraine has kept Putin's army away from NATO's borders and from our borders. And it is very much a David versus Goliath fight, a deeply Christian archetype. And I suspect that the ambition of Russian imperialism stretches far beyond Donetsk and Lugansk, but it seeks to reestablish the sphere of influence lost after the collapse of the USSR. And the fact that today, behind Przemysl and behind Rzeszów, we do not have Russian Federation, but we have a bleeding out, but still fighting, still gasping for air Ukraine, is only due to the bravery and the determination of the Ukrainians fighting still until today. Therefore, not allowing for Putin's victory and a peace on the terms of Kremlin and stopping Russian imperial expansion is the single best strategic investment in our peaceful future here. Supporting Ukraine and thereby pushing the Russian aggression away from European borders is not charity. It is our national interest. We must do everything in our power to provide hope, to strengthen Ukrainians' defense posture and negotiating position. And as you know, on the night of September 10th, in an unprecedented act of aggression, 21 Russian drones on purpose violated the Polish airspace. And Poland and NATO are allies. We acted fast to protect our allied airspace. And for the first time, Russian drones have been shot down over the territory of NATO. However, the same night, Ukraine faced an attack of over 415 drones and over 40 missiles. And then, not much later, on 19th of September, Estonia reported that 3 MiG-31 Russian fighter jets entered and stayed in its airspace for 12 minutes. If Russia undertakes such actions, it means that it tolerates the risk of escalation. It means that our deterrence here must be stronger. The Russians are testing us, and they do so because they believe they can. They will do everything to test and probe and hit below the threshold of an open conflict. This time, impunity cannot be allowed. Putin only understands the language of force, as proven by Russians' destructive actions in Georgia, in Chechnya, in the Balkans, Moldova, Syria, Libya, all up to, of course, Crimea and Ukraine today. And Poland, therefore, pushes for stronger sanctions and tariffs on Russia and its neighbors. We must make the cost of this war unbearable on the aggressor. Windfall revenues from frozen Russian assets should serve to rebuild what Moscow has destroyed in Ukraine. And dear students, let us be clear. Putin does not fear so much NATO as a defensive alliance. He's not threatened by NATO. He's threatened by democracy. He's threatened by democratic expansion. Putin, like all dictators, is threatened by democratic ideas, democratic government, and democratic sentiments. He cannot tolerate a successful and democratic Ukraine on Russia borders, especially if it is also to prosper economically, because that prosperous Ukraine would undermine the Kremlin's own regime stability and rationale for Russian autocracy. And while we defend it, let us not take our rights and our democracy and our peace here that we enjoy today for granted. June 4th is a holiday of freedom in Poland, a celebration of the first free and fair elections of 1989 following the collapse of USSR. But June 4th is not only a day of celebration, it is also a day of a bloody warning. You see, my grandfather was a refugee from China. As a 6-year-old boy, together with his parents, he fled famine during 1940s in China by boat, crossing from China, mainland China, to Bangkok, Thailand. And his life was marked by exile and by survival. And therefore, in our family, we have the memory of 4th of June, also as the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. On that night, from June 3rd to June 4th, 1989, on our celebration of freedom here, the Chinese army opened fire on peaceful pro-democracy student protests, students like yourselves. And nearly 10,000 civilians were killed that night. June 4th reminds us that freedom can be both hard-won, but also hard denied. The remains of the students were burned, and their bodies were hidden and cast into the sewers. And it reminds us that liberty and democracy, the right to education, to freedom, that each of you here enjoys, that each of us enjoys here, is never guaranteed, is not to be taken for granted, but is to be cherished and guarded and protected. And I truly believe that we must vehemently preserve our democracies and the rule of law and resist disinformation and the rise of the extreme populists. And whether it's the extremists in Poland, Assemblée Nationale in France, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Nigel Farage Reform UK Party, Viktor Orban's Fidesz in Hungary, the pattern is the same: Euroscepticism, anti-immigration, anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, and at times even a strange fascination with neo-fascism and with the politics of Vladimir Putin. And Democrats and we must not fall into the populist trap of these rhetorics, no matter how tempting such populism may seem in the short term, because strategically, it leads only to a tragedy and serves the Kremlin. Dear students, we are here, and you're here studying at a unique time in Europe. And however flawed and sometimes ineffective, but we still have liberal governments in power across key states in Europe: Poland, France, Germany, UK. Unfortunately, that might not be the case in a few years' time. So let us use this wisely. Europe faces an existential choice: unite and act as a higher power, or to become marginalized. Either we start exerting ourselves and demonstrating collective unity, strength, solidarity, and thus our independence and deterrence, or our bureaucracy will become stuck in an imperial sandwich between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Therefore, we must stop acting small. Let us remember, and I'm saying it as a progressive politician, the greatest European achievements: the Greek philosophy, the Roman civilization, the Judeo-Christian values, which later gave birth to secular ideas of human dignity and individual freedom and human rights. And whether we want it or not, it falls on us and it falls on you to defend them. Dear students, each of you has a role to play. I encourage you to take on as much responsibility as you can and fight tirelessly and ceaselessly in service of values which you hold dear. The future of Poland, of Europe, and indeed of the free world depends on you. It depends on every one of us here. And just one last point to finish off. I have found that political alliances rise and fall. And scientific teams as well are bound over projects which begin and which end. And both often in a spirit of fierce competition. However, what endures is friendship. So look around you. Look around the colleagues which are sitting in front, behind you, and on your left and on your right. Because I believe that there exists amongst us here an unspoken bond. A bond that unites the rebels, the dreamers, the mathematicians, the scientists, the physicists, and engineers, those who, each of us in our own way, try to strive to understand the world better and to improve it when it gets apocalyptic. And no matter where we come from and how diverse our fields of education and study are, no matter what our color of our skin might be, what our ethnicity is, who we love, we're all equal and far more alike than it actually seems. That is why I hope that this academic year today, beginning today, above all, will bring you new friendships. Because there are very few things in this world as powerful and as consoling and as necessary as friendship itself. Brotherhood in the face of challenge, and community in the face of uncertainty. And I've learned this not only as an abstract truth, but as a lived one. In 2019, when I was deployed to Yemen, I felt ill with malaria. And I was initially misdiagnosed in a local hospital, and I was not administered malaria drugs early enough. So in the end, I ended up lying on top of my office in Aden, in Yemen, with IV drips hanging from my window, just to reduce my fever and to reduce my chills, and myself just falling in and out of consciousness. And it was my friends from the International Committee of the Red Cross and my friends from my Yemeni team of the Polish Humanitarian Action that saved me, that saved my life, that fed me, that kept storytelling to me, and cheering me up until I returned to full health. And later, when I faced what was really a quite difficult and sometimes even brutal parliamentary campaign, full of disinformation and propaganda, it was again friends who decided to sleep on mattresses in my apartment in Łódź for a few months and who campaigned with me on the streets day in, day out, and that allowed me to carry through. For if we are able to fight for tangible change in the world, no one of us can achieve it alone. We must support one another. We must help each other persevere and rise. Friendship and solidarity is not something extra. It is the foundation. It is what carries us through struggle, and it is what gives us the courage to build something better. And so now, let's get some friends, and let's get to work. Thank you.